In the mountains of Harlan County, Kentucky, there came a time when the law was not your friend. It was a hired gun, a time when a union card was a death warrant, and children learned to sleep on the floor to dodge the bullets fired through their bedroom walls in the dead of night. The outside world called it a labor dispute, but for the people living it, it was a war. A war so brutal that its anthem was not just a song, but a desperate question. Which side are you on? Today, we descend into the darkness of bloody Harlan to tell the story of the decade-long battle that forced every man, woman, and child to choose. To understand the war, you first have to understand the world that was lost, and the men who were pushed until they had nothing left to lose. Before the bullets flew, there was the quiet desperation of the company town. Imagine a world sealed off by ancient mountains, a place where the coal company wasn't just your employer, it was your landlord, your grocer, your government, and your god. You lived in a company house, a flimsy shack perched on a hillside, often without running water, that could be taken from you at a moment's notice. Your children were born with company doctors, and you bought their food at the company store. But you didn't use real money. You used scrip, a private currency that was worthless anywhere else, and the prices were always inflated. This was a system designed for debt, a set of invisible chains that tethered you and your family to the mine. Every day you went deeper into the hole, both literally and financially. Your life, from cradle to grave, was mortgaged to King Coal, and the work itself was a daily descent into hell. Deep beneath the beautiful green hills, men crawled on their bellies in the dark, breathing in the fine black dust that would one day choke the life from their lungs. They gambled every shift against the black damp, a pocket of unbreathable gas that could suffocate you in an instant, or the ever-present threat of a roof collapse that could bury you alive. For clawing the wealth of the nation from the earth's guts, they were paid pennies. These weren't just workers. They were fathers, husbands, and sons. They were proud mountain folk whose families had lived on this land for generations. Their dreams were simple: a small plot of land to call their own, shoes for their children, and the dignity of a fair day's pay for a deadly day's work. They were men who understood hardship, who accepted the risks of the mine as a fact of life. They were patient, they were resilient, and they were quiet. But then the Great Depression hit, and the coal operators in Harlan, in a final act of desperation and greed, slashed the miners' wages to a level that was no longer survivable. It was the final turn of the screw on a people already pressed to their limits. This wasn't just an insult, it was a death sentence delivered by starvation. And in that moment, the quiet patience that had defined these men for generations began to curdle into a cold, hard rage. The mountains themselves seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the spark that would ignite the powder keg. By the spring of 1931, the whispers had turned into a low growl that echoed through the hollows. The United Mine Workers had arrived, and with them, a flicker of hope that terrified the coal operators. For every man who signed a union card, a family was thrown out of their home. For every secret meeting, a union man was beaten on a dark road. The law, in the form of Sheriff J.H. Blair and his army of deputized thugs, was no longer a shield for the people, it was a hammer for the companies. The crime scene wasn't a single place. The entire county was becoming one, primed for an explosion. That explosion came on May the 5th in a narrow pass near the town of Evarts. The scene itself was deceptively peaceful. A dusty road winding between two steep, wooded hillsides, a natural choke point. On any other day, it was a place of quiet Appalachian beauty. But on this day, the trees weren't just trees, they were hiding places. The silence wasn't peace, it was the tense, held breath before a storm. On those hillsides, miners lay waiting, their squirrel rifles and old shotguns clutched in their hands. They were men who had been hunted, and now they had become the hunters. When the shooting finally stopped, a new kind of silence fell over the pass, a heavy, ringing silence punctuated by the groans of the wounded. The scene left for the authorities was one of utter chaos. 3 company cars, riddled with bullet holes, sat stalled on the road. The dust was littered with a confusing mix of shell casings, the heavy brass of the deputies' machine guns, and the simple spent shells from the miners' hunting rifles. Blood stained the dirt road, a testament to the ferocity of the 15-minute battle. The immediate evidence told a terrifying story, but offered no easy answers. 3 deputies and 1 miner were dead. The official report would call it a cold-blooded ambush, an act of insurrection by lawless miners. But the miners would whisper a different tale, one of self-defense, of a motorcade of gun thugs on their way to shoot up another picket line, of a people who finally decided to shoot back. The tracks leading away from the road vanished into the dense woods, swallowed by a wilderness that knew how to keep its secrets. The Battle of Evarts left behind more than bodies and brass. It left behind a bone-chilling question that hung in the smoke-filled air. This wasn't a simple murder. This was an organized, armed uprising. Who had planned it? Who gave the order to fire? The scene spoke of desperation and rage, but the wilderness offered no confessions. It only confirmed a terrible new reality. The war in Harlan County had gone hot, and the mountains themselves had become the first and most mysterious witness to the bloodshed. In the chaotic hours after the Battle of Evarts, as the bodies of the deputies were carried out of the pass, Sheriff J.H. Blair didn't need a detective to find his prime suspects. He already had his culprits. For months, a clear and public enemy had been challenging his authority and the absolute power of the coal operators. The finger of blame pointed squarely, and without a moment's hesitation, at the organizers of the United Mine Workers of America. These were the men who had come into his county preaching a gospel of discontent. They were, in the eyes of the establishment, outside agitators with foreign ideas about collective bargaining and workers' rights. They held secret meetings in darkened schoolhouses and on remote hillsides, whispering promises of a better life into the ears of desperate men. They were the ones who had lit the fuse of rebellion, and in the minds of the company men, the explosion at Evarts was the inevitable result. Their motive seemed undeniable. For weeks, Blair's deputies had been systematically breaking the strike, beating organizers and evicting families with brutal efficiency. The union was losing. The ambush at Evarts wasn't just a random act of violence, it was a calculated message, a bloody declaration that the UMWA would not be crushed without a fight. It was a violent attempt to seize control of the county and to terrorize the law-abiding citizens and workers who had refused to join their cause. This wasn't a mystery. It was an open war, and the Union had just fired its deadliest shot. The evidence, as far as the law in Harlan was concerned, was self-evident. Every man on that hillside was either a Union member or a sympathizer. The Union had been advocating for resistance, and now resistance had turned deadly. Whispers immediately became official reports. Names of known Union leaders and the most outspoken miners were put on arrest warrants. The narrative was simple and powerful. The Union came, and then there was violence. Therefore, the Union was to blame. For Sheriff Blair, the case was already open and shut, and the manhunt for the Union men began immediately. But while Sheriff Blair's fury was aimed squarely at the Union men on the hills, a colder, more complicated suspicion began to take root behind the closed doors of the Coal Operators Association. The ambush at Evarts had been too perfect, too precise. The miners were desperate, yes, but this level of coordination suggested something more than just spontaneous rage. It suggested information. It suggested a leak, and a leak could only come from the inside. Suspicion, like a mountain mist, began to curl around the figures who stood between the two warring camps, the mine foreman and the company guards who had been deputized by Blair. These were men who came from mining families themselves, who spoke the same language and understood the grievances of the men in the pits, yet they drew their paychecks directly from the operators. They were trusted by both sides, and therefore trusted by neither. Could one of these men, a man who walked the line between loyalty and blood, have been the true architect of the massacre? The motive wouldn't have been a simple cry for workers' rights. It would have been something far more personal and venomous. Imagine a foreman whose father had been killed in a roof collapse years earlier, a death ruled an accident, but always whispered to have been caused by company negligence. He had risen through the ranks, his loyalty a perfect mask for a patient, simmering hatred. For a man like that, the union wasn't a cause, it was a weapon. Looking back, the signs were there. One particular foreman, known for his harsh discipline, had been conspicuously absent from the convoy that day, claiming a sudden illness. In the aftermath, his grief seemed hollow, his questions to the other deputies sharp, not with sorrow, but with the careful precision of a man confirming the details of a plan gone right. He knew the convoy's route, their departure time, and their numbers. A single, anonymous tip to a Union contact was all it would have taken to turn that dusty road into a killing field, sacrificing a few of Blair's thugs to ignite a war that could burn his true enemies to the ground. The thought was chilling, that the Battle of Evarts wasn't an act of rebellion, but a calculated act of revenge, orchestrated by a traitor who wore the company's own badge. But there was a third shadow that fell across the mountains, one that terrified the Union and the operators alike. This wasn't a local feud. The Great Depression had set the entire nation on edge, and whispers of revolution were drifting out of the cities and into the forgotten hollows of Appalachia. This third suspect wasn't a man, but an idea, a radical, violent ideology that saw the struggle in Harlan not as a labor dispute, but as the first battleground in a new American Civil War. Agents of more extreme movements, men who found the United Mine Workers too tame, began to slip into the county. They weren't miners. They were professional organizers, hardened veterans of bloodier conflicts in other parts of the country. They spoke not of contracts and wage increases, but of seizing the mines and overthrowing the system entirely. They saw the miners' desperation not as a problem to be solved, but as fuel for a much larger fire. Their motive was pure and terrifyingly impersonal: chaos. For them, a negotiated peace was a failure. They needed martyrs. They needed headlines. They needed a war. The Battle of Evarts, with its shocking death toll, was a perfect victory in their eyes. It escalated the conflict beyond the point of no return, forcing the hand of both the Union and the state. It transformed a local strike into a national symbol of class warfare. Their presence was felt not in public speeches, but in the shadows. Strange pamphlets would appear in the mining camps overnight, calling for armed resistance. Seasoned men with city accents were seen in hushed conversations with the most desperate and angry of the young miners, teaching them not how to picket, but how to build a barricade, how to choose a location for an ambush. They were ghosts in the machine, whispering poison into the ears of men who were already half-mad with hunger and injustice. For these outsiders, the dead at Evarts were not a tragedy. They were a necessary sacrifice to ignite the revolution they craved. In the wake of the Battle of Evarts, Sheriff Blair's investigation was not a search for truth. It was a hunt for vengeance. He unleashed his army of deputies with a single simple objective: round up every known Union man and sympathizer. Warrants were issued for dozens of miners, but this wasn't a process of careful arrests. It was a brutal sweep. Doors were kicked in at midnight. Men were dragged from their beds in front of their screaming wives and children, their faces already bloodied by the time they were thrown into the back of a truck. But the mountains, which had served as a fortress for the coal operators, now became a sanctuary for the miners. The deputies, many of them outsiders themselves, were clumsy and loud in this terrain. They knew the roads, but the miners knew the land. Men vanished into the deep woods and winding hollows, swallowed whole by a wilderness that was loyal to its own. Posses would track a man for days, following a clear trail to the mouth of an abandoned mine or a remote cabin, only to find the trail had gone cold, as if the man they were chasing had simply turned to mist and drifted away on the wind. The few men they did manage to capture offered no clear answers. Under the brutal persuasion of a deputy's blackjack, stories changed and collapsed. Some men, desperate to stop the beating, would name anyone, spinning wild tales of a grand Union conspiracy led by organizers who were already long gone, having fled the state. Others, defiant to the end, would say nothing at all. The evidence Blair presented to the prosecutors was a tangled mess of coerced confessions and contradictory testimonies. The promise of a swift, clean conviction for the murder of his deputies evaporated into a fog of confusion and lies. The investigation was hitting a wall, and Blair's frustration festered into a more indiscriminate cruelty. Unable to catch the supposed ringleaders, his deputies turned their rage on the community at large. They would stop cars on lonely roads, not to ask questions, but to deliver beatings. They prowled the edges of the mining camps, their presence a constant, suffocating threat. The initial assumption that a few Union leaders were responsible was proving impossible to prove. The hunt for a specific culprit devolved into a general war on the mining population, and with every failed raid and fruitless interrogation, the fear in Harlan County grew deeper, and the truth buried itself a little further in the dark, silent earth. As Sheriff Blair's hunt intensified, his deputies slammed into a wall. It wasn't made of stone or wood, but of something far stronger, the absolute, unyielding silence of the mountain people. The louder the deputies shouted, the deeper the silence became. Questions were met with blank stares. Threats were answered with a shrug. Men who had worked side by side their whole lives, who knew every secret in the holler, suddenly saw nothing, heard nothing, and knew nothing. An invisible pact of silence, an omerta of the coalfields, had descended upon Harlan County. This silence was not born of ignorance, but of a cold, calculated understanding of survival. To speak to Sheriff Blair's men was not to help the cause of justice. It was to paint a target on your own front door. Everyone knew the price of talking. It meant a visit in the dead of night, the sound of heavy boots on your porch, a beating that left you unable to work for a week. It meant your wife and children being terrorized by gun thugs who would shine their headlights into your windows just to let you know they were watching. But the silence was also a matter of profound loyalty. In these isolated communities, blood and neighborly bonds were the only true law. The men on that hillside at Evarts were not abstract criminals. They were your cousin, your brother-in-law, the man who helped you rebuild your fence last spring. To turn against them was to turn against your own kin, to betray the only social fabric you had. The law of J.H. Blair was temporary and corrupt, but the judgment of your neighbors was forever. You would starve before you became a snitch. The psychological toll was immense, especially for those who might have been tempted to speak. Old man Hemphill, who lived on the road to Evarts, made the mistake of telling the postman he'd seen a car he didn't recognize parked near the pass the day before the shooting. It was an innocent remark, nothing more. A week later, he woke to find his family's milk cow, their only source of extra income, lying dead in his field with its throat cut. No one had to say a word. The message was understood by everyone in a 50-mile radius. After that, no one dared to even whisper about what they might have seen. The mountains had closed ranks, and the truth of what happened at Evarts was locked behind a wall of fear that no amount of force could ever break down. For years, the war in Harlan was a grinding stalemate of terror and endurance. The seasons changed, but the fear did not. The truth of the Battle of Evarts and the countless ambushes that followed seemed destined to be buried forever, lost to the wall of silence and the corruption of the law. The turning point, when it finally came, wasn't a dusty clue found in an old cabin or a deathbed confession whispered in the dark. It came from the outside world, in the form of men who carried briefcases instead of shotguns. In the mid-1930s, a United States Senate subcommittee, known as the La Follette Committee, began investigating violations of workers' rights across the country. And their gaze finally fell upon the dark and bloody ground of Harlan County. These men from Washington were a new kind of power, one that Sheriff Blair couldn't intimidate and the operators couldn't buy. They came armed not with guns, but with subpoenas, and they began to do something no one in Harlan had dared to do for years. They began to listen. The forgotten clue wasn't a single object, it was the collective memory of the people. One by one, miners, their wives, and their children came forward to testify. Each story, on its own, had been just a whisper of pain. But now, under the protection of federal marshals, the whispers became a roar. They spoke of beatings on dark roads, of cars dynamited, of the murder of Bennett Music, a 15-year-old boy. The committee chambers, hundreds of miles away, filled with the ghosts of Harlan's decade of suffering. But the clue that finally broke the back of the beast wasn't a memory. It was a number on a ledger. The committee's investigators got their hands on the financial records of the Harlan County Coal Operators Association. And there it was, in cold, hard print, a secret slush fund. They found cancelled checks and accounting entries that proved beyond any doubt that the operators were directly paying the salaries of hundreds of Sheriff Blair's deputies. The gun thugs terrorizing the county weren't public servants. They were a private army, funded by corporate interests. Suddenly, the whole dark picture snapped into focus. This wasn't just a case of a brutal sheriff abusing his power. It was a conspiracy. The law in Harlan County hadn't just been broken, it had been bought and paid for. This financial record was the key, the undeniable proof that turned whispers into evidence and paved the way for the unmasking of the entire rotten system. The La Follette Committee's investigation acted like a slow, inexorable sunrise over the dark mountains of Harlan. For years, the world had seen only the shadows, the gun thugs, the ambushes, the terror. Now, as the light of federal scrutiny grew brighter, the long, distorted shadows were traced back to the men who cast them. The ledger, that simple book of numbers, was the key that unlocked the entire conspiracy. The moment of revelation was at hand, and it was more chilling than any single act of violence. The true perpetrator of the Harlan County War was not a single man hiding in the hills with a rifle. It wasn't a radical agitator with a bomb. The true mastermind was a collective, an entity with a clean collar and a respectable name. The Harlan County Coal Operators Association. The ledger exposed them with brutal, undeniable clarity. There, in neat columns, were the payments, thousands of dollars flowing directly from the association's accounts into a special fund controlled by Sheriff J.H. Blair. The law in Harlan County wasn't an institution. It was a line item on a corporate expense report. And their motive? It wasn't personal hatred or political ideology or even a twisted sense of justice. It was something far colder, far more mundane, and infinitely more terrifying. Profit. The motive was greed, distilled to its purest and most violent form. A union contract meant paying livable wages, investing in mine safety, and giving up the feudal control they held over their workforce. It was cheaper to hire killers. The beatings, the evictions, the dynamite, the midnight raids, it was all just the cost of doing business. It was a simple, brutal equation where a miner's life was worth less than the cost of a union contract. This single damning revelation unmasked the entire decade of terror. Sheriff J.H. Blair was not a rogue lawman. He was the highly effective, well-paid manager of the association's security forces. His deputies were not peacekeepers. They were mercenaries on a corporate payroll. The violence wasn't random chaos. It was a calculated, systematic campaign of intimidation designed to protect profits at any human cost. The web of terror that had seemed so tangled and confusing was, in fact, devastatingly simple. It was a privately funded war waged by the rich against the poor. The unmasking was complete. The smoke of the Battle of Evarts finally cleared to reveal the true enemy, and they weren't wearing a miner's dusty overalls or a deputy's badge. They were wearing business suits and sitting on the boards of coal companies. They had turned an entire county into their personal fiefdom and had purchased the law itself to serve as their private army. The gun wasn't in the hand of one man, but in the ink of the men who signed the checks. Now that we know the truth, let's go back. Let's stand in the shadows of those mountains and watch the tragedy unfold, not as a mystery, but as the execution of a plan. The terror in Harlan County began not with the roar of a gun, but with the quiet scratch of a pen on a checkbook in a smoke-filled office. It was decided, with the cold arithmetic of greed, that it was cheaper to pay for violence than to pay a living wage. A ledger became a rifle, and an accountant's entry became an ambush. Picture again that dusty road near Evarts. The convoy of company cars rolls into the narrow pass, full of men who believe the law is on their side because they carry the sheriff's badge. They don't know that their lives are just a down payment. Then, from the hillside, comes a single crack, sharp and clear, echoing off the rock faces. And in its echo, a hellstorm erupts. The air fills with the deep, stuttering bark of Thompson submachine guns and the sharp, scattered retort of hunting rifles. For 15 minutes, the pass is a vortex of smoke, splintered glass, and the deafening noise of a community tearing itself apart. Then, as suddenly as it began, there is silence. A silence made heavy by the sight of stalled cars, shattered windows, and still forms lying in the road. Imagine being a child in a company shack, trying to sleep. The only sound is the crickets and the wind in the pines. Then, another sound. The low rumble of a car coming slowly up the holler, a car that doesn't belong. Your mother's hand is suddenly on your shoulder, pulling you from the bed to the floorboards. You lie there, heart hammering against your ribs, smelling the damp earth beneath the house. A moment later, the night explodes. The window shatters inward, and the wall next to your bed splinters as a shotgun blast tears through the thin wood. The car speeds away, its taillights vanishing into the darkness, leaving behind the tinkle of falling glass, your mother's whispered prayers, and a fear that will never, ever leave you. The roads themselves became weapons. A union man driving home to his family would see a pair of headlights appear in his rearview mirror, growing closer, pinning him in their glare. He would grip the wheel, his knuckles white, his mind racing. Was it just a neighbor, or was it them? Every curve in the road was a potential trap. Every dark stretch of woods a place to be run off into a ditch. The county, once a home, had become a hunting ground, and the journey from the mine to your front porch was the most dangerous part of the day. And then there was the ultimate act of this calculated terror. A union organizer, Marshall Music, is driving with his family. The road ahead is clear. For a moment, it might feel like a normal day, but then the world is ripped apart by a deafening roar. The force of the blast throws the car from the road, twisting it into a barely recognizable shape of steel and smoke. In that single horrific instant, a journey is ended. A family is shattered. A 15-year-old boy's life is extinguished, not in a moment of passion or rage, but as a consequence of a line item in a corporate budget titled "Strike Expenses." This was the war in Harlan. It wasn't a fight between two equal sides. It was a systematic campaign of terror, planned in boardrooms and executed by men who had sold their badges and their souls. Every scream in the night, every bullet hole in a cabin wall, every newly dug grave was a direct result of a choice made by men in suits who likely never set foot in a mine. The true horror of bloody Harlan is not just what happened, but the chilling, deliberate reason why. When the trials finally began, they were not held in the small, compromised courthouse in Harlan. The case had been elevated to the federal level, and the coal operators and Sheriff Blair, men who were once kings in their own domain, were now defendants in a United States court. The atmosphere was electric. Miners who had once hidden from Blair's thugs now sat in the witness stand, protected by federal marshals, their faces illuminated by the flashbulbs of a curious national press. For the first time, the quiet, fearful whispers of the hollers were being entered into the official record, spoken aloud for the whole world to hear. The defendants, the powerful men of the Coal Operators Association, and their chief enforcer, J.H. Blair, sat at their tables with an air of defiant indignation. They were not accustomed to being questioned. In their eyes, this was a political circus, a witch hunt orchestrated by Roosevelt's New Deal to break the rightful power of industry. Their high-priced lawyers spun tales of defending private property against a violent, communist-inspired insurrection. They portrayed Blair not as a tyrant, but as a heroic lawman standing against anarchy. But their narrative began to crumble under the weight of the testimony. One by one, miners and their wives took the stand. With simple, halting words, they painted a devastating mural of the decade of terror. They spoke of night riding, of beatings, of houses riddled with buckshot, of the constant, gnawing fear. They presented the ledger, the cold, hard proof of a conspiracy. The trial became a battle of two realities, the operator's world of contracts and legal rights, and the miner's world of blood and survival. And yet, in a stunning blow to the government and the miners, the first trial in 1938 ended in a hung jury. The operators' immense influence, their deep connections, and their ability to cast doubt had proven just strong enough. For a moment, it seemed as if the wall of power was unbreakable. The operators walked out of the courtroom, not convicted, their smirks a final insult to the men and women who had dared to speak against them. It was a moment of profound injustice, an echo of the crooked law they had mastered for so long. But the verdict in the court of public opinion had already been delivered. The La Follette Committee's investigation and the national press coverage had exposed the rot in Harlan County to the entire nation. The operators had escaped a conviction, but they had not escaped the shame. Facing the certainty of a second, even more grueling federal trial, and with their public reputation in tatters, they finally understood that their private war was over. In 1939, after nearly a decade of bloodshed, the Harlan County Coal Operators Association did what no amount of violence could force them to do. They surrendered. They signed a contract with the United Mine Workers of America. There were no jail sentences for the masterminds, no hangman's noose for the architects of the terror. The justice served wasn't the clean, righteous verdict the miners had hoped for, but it was a victory nonetheless, won not by a gavel, but by sheer, bloody-minded endurance. The ink on the union contract was barely dry, but the war had already left ghosts that would walk the hollers for generations. For the miners and their families, the victory was real, but it was not clean. They had won a measure of dignity, a livable wage, and the right to stand together, but the cost was etched into their very souls. A piece of paper couldn't bring back a murdered son, heal the memory of a shotgun blast through a bedroom wall, or erase the years spent living in the shadow of a gun thug's menace. The men who survived the mines and the picket lines carried the war home with them. It showed in the haunted look in their eyes, in the way they taught their children to distrust any man in a suit, any car that slowed down on a dark road. The fear, once it gets into the bones, doesn't leave. It's passed down, a bitter inheritance. Sheriff J.H. Blair and the coal operators who had funded his reign of terror never saw the inside of a prison cell. They returned to their comfortable lives, their power diminished, but their freedom intact. They had lost the war, but they had escaped justice. Blair faded from public life, but he never faded from memory. His name became a new kind of ghost, a bogeyman used by parents to frighten their children into behaving, a curse whispered in the corners of union halls for the next 50 years. The families of the deputies and gun thugs, many of whom were just local men trying to earn a paycheck, found themselves on the wrong side of a line that would never be erased. Their children grew up bearing names associated with betrayal and violence, forever marked by the choices their fathers had made. The war redrew the map of Harlan County. The lines weren't on any piece of paper, They were lines of loyalty and betrayal that ran straight through families, churches, and neighborhoods. The neighbor who had put on a deputy's badge was never fully trusted again. The store owner who had sided with the company found his business mysteriously dwindling. Friendships that had endured for a lifetime were shattered by the simple, brutal question of which side you were on. The children of union men and the children of company men went to the same schools, but they carried with them a silent, inherited animosity. Harlan County was no longer just a place. It was a memory of a war, and everyone who lived there was a veteran, whether they had carried a gun or not. Their lives were forever defined not by the peace that followed, but by the battle they had been forced to endure. You might think this war is over, a faded chapter in a history book, but you would be wrong. The story of Bloody Harlan is not history. It is a living memory etched into the very landscape of the county. Go there today and stand in that narrow pass near Evarts. When a coal truck rumbles by, the sound still echoes off the hillsides like the ghosts of machine gun fire. The road has been paved, but the place itself remembers. It is a scar on the land that will never fully heal. The tangible remnants are still there if you know where to look. They say that in some of the older brick buildings in town, you can still find the patched-over pockmarks left by stray bullets from forgotten shootouts. Walk through the old hillside cemeteries, and you'll find the tombstones of the men who fell on both sides, their names carved in stone, their stories now reduced to a pair of dates. These silent stone witnesses are the most honest memorials to the conflict, a quiet testament to the price that was paid. But the most powerful echo of Bloody Harlan isn't made of stone or steel. It's a song. That night, when Florence Reese, a hungry and terrified Union man's wife, tore a page from a calendar and scribbled down the words to "Which side are you on?" she created something more powerful than dynamite. That song escaped the mountains. It became the anthem for the oppressed everywhere, sung on picket lines from Detroit to London, chanted in the streets during the civil rights movement, and translated into dozens of languages. A simple question, born of desperation in a Kentucky shack, became a global call to arms for justice. And the stories themselves are a living remnant. Sit on a porch with the old-timers, the grandsons and granddaughters of the men who fought, and they will tell you. They will tell you about the night the gun thugs came, stories passed down like family heirlooms. They'll tell you that the deep-seated distrust of outsiders and authority isn't paranoia. It's a lesson learned in blood. The world moves on, calendars change, but in Harlan County, the past is never truly past. It breathes in the mountain air, a constant whispering reminder that you must always be ready to answer that one simple question. And so we return to where we began, to that simple, haunting question, born of terror and hunger. Which side are you on? For a decade, the war in Harlan County was the answer. It wasn't a dispute over wages. It was a bloody 10-year war fought to decide if a man's life was worth more than a ton of coal. It was a war to determine if the law belonged to the people or if it could be bought and sold like any other commodity on the open market. This is a story not just of a crime, but of a conspiracy written in a ledger book. It's a chilling reminder of what happens when corporate greed is given a badge and a gun, when human lives are reduced to columns of profit and loss. But it is also a fierce testament to the enduring power of the human spirit when pushed to the absolute edge. The coal operators had the money, the guns, and the law. But the miners had something more powerful. They had their solidarity. And they had a song that turned their suffering into a shield, and their defiance into an anthem that would outlive all the men who tried to silence them. The guns in Harlan County are silent now. The picket lines are gone. But the story remains, a warning carried on the mountain wind. It reminds us that there are moments in history when there are no neutrals, when silence itself is a choice. And now, my friends, you know the story of Bloody Harlan, a story written in coal dust and paid for in blood that still asks every single one of us, Which side are you on?